And at the request of the governor's office, they thought it would be helpful if we heard from this next group. And you can tell from the headline there, the slide, the issue is going to be centered around partnership for, well, student success, but titled Partnership for College Completion. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Westbrook, who heads this group, and they have some interesting approaches to the whole issue of student success, and we're going to spend about an hour on this till about 2:30, 2:45, and then we'll get back to a conversation about just what we call trustee networking, and we can talk about some of the things we talked about this morning, and then add to that list, or really talk about anything you want. Dr. Bowman's going to be back here at that time, and you may have some requests of the IBHE on how we can help you out more. So that'll be a free-flowing conversation. But before we get to that, we're going to hear from Kyle Westbrook and his team. Kyle, welcome, and come on up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Cross, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, trustees. We're really excited to be here, and I will not mess up the microphone. Before I get into introducing the rest of the folks that are going to present today, I thought I'd take a few minutes to introduce the Partnership for College Completion and what it is that we do, who we are as an organization, and what it is that we're specifically focused on, not only for this presentation today, but also in the near term and in the long term for students across the state of Illinois. As Chairman Cross said, my name is Kyle Westbrook. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion. We are a newish 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and we are really focused on improving outcomes for low-income students, and primarily in the Chicago region, but also at our large public universities throughout the state. And we'll get into some data shortly here that will look at and examine some of the issues that have importance to low-income students across the state. But this organization was founded really to take a laser-like focus on outcomes for low-income students and where the state is. And the way that we are focusing on that, or the way that we believe that we will support the kinds of change and outcomes, is really a three-pronged strategy. First is raising public awareness on the issues of importance for low-income students. And this is all contained in a document that most of you are looking at right now. So good, take that home and curl up with it. And the first thing is then focusing on public awareness, and that is, how do we increase the awareness of the issues of importance for low-income students and really rally support around improving outcomes. The second is working alongside institutions of higher education themselves in providing technical support. So the second lever that we will pull on is really that technical support, and really pleased to have been working alongside President Mayman, Interim President Freeman at Northern, Jack Thomas at Western, and others to really look at what are some of the evidence-based approaches that are having an impact on graduation rates across the nation, and then how do we do more of that in the state. And then the third area is in public policy, and then how do we make sure that our elected officials have student success at the forefront of their minds when policy decisions are being made. I was just over listening to Mr. Berger's presentation about, from IBHE's point of view, this great history of higher education and the ways in which our policy environment has, over the years, become less supportive of student success. And so we see a major part of our role is to work alongside those policy leaders to change that trajectory. So we're fortunate and really pleased to be here today to talk with you about what are the ways, first of all, what is the data telling us about student success across the state, across the nation, and across the state. And then finally, what are some of the mechanisms or some of the things that you can do as trustees to ensure that student success is the priority, the first priority for institutions of higher education around the state. And we've been fortunate to been working alongside a great partner in this work, and that is Dr. Jose Luis Santos, who formerly, before starting his own company, a JLS strategist, was the Vice President of Higher Education Policy for Education Trust, a nationally based organization that focuses on equity and improving outcomes for low-income African American, Latino students across the country. Wrote, and you'll see this, a number of great reports about equity and a great sort of view of how do we actually improve outcomes for students who need it the most. And so we've been pleased to really partner with Jose Luis. And also you'll see in your folders is an article from a year or so, maybe 2 years ago, that Jose Luis and Kathy Haycock wrote about the trustee role in elevating student success. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jose Luis Santos from JLS Strategist to talk about the national perspective on student success. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get set up here. So first of all, I think your governor is very wise to ask that you have a student success session as part of training for trustees. I think our views are in alignment with respect to the importance of student success, particularly with the group of folks who are entrusted with oversight at the institutions you lead. So first and foremost, as we begin the formal part of the presentation here, I just wanted to present you with a couple of different statements of facts. Let's see what you have up there. Okay. So essentially, I think we're all familiar that the U.S. is experiencing increased gaps in income and wealth inequality, and that these growing problems have large implications for social mobility. And that I think if we can agree that receiving a quality education has consistently proved to be consequential in actually for young people moving up the social and economic ladder. So as we have great disparities, education has always been important, but becomes even more important in at least trying to close those gaps in mobility. As far as trustees are concerned, I think your role is super important in this oversight role, and you can have a very direct influence in student success, particularly because you have oversight responsibilities in who you bring into your institutions as well, the hiring and firing. And so if I'd like to just kind of leave you with a 2 points in particular about how you can think about your role from my perspective and really the partnership perspective here, is that to be great stewards of the universities that you are actually entrusted to lead, we think, one, that what the numbers actually say about your institution's contributions to restoring opportunity in America are important. So you should know the numbers at your institutions, and we'll talk more about that. We also believe that you have a role, very direct role, in creating the capable leadership at your institutions, the teams that are committed to aggressively expanding that contribution. And this is not a one kind of hit wonder. This is an overtime approach. So it's very important to be intentional and purposeful about who you bring in to run those institutions. We think that trustees that actually prioritize and nurture student success and engage leadership and faculty as problem solvers are likely to have the most success and actually move the needle on both increased graduation rates, completion rates, and also closing any equity gaps that exist. So really quickly, I'm not going to go over that in the interest of time, but as was mentioned, I'm the president of a consulting firm in DC that has a lot of experience doing this kind of work. Faculty member, a prior institutional research person where I cut my teeth on the data, both on the budgets and student success. And have had a couple of other different experiences as well that add to this. It was mentioned that there were some publications of relevance that I think would be useful for you. The first one is actually in your packet, and it was a commission piece that myself and Katie Haycock, who's the former president of the Education Trust, we wrote about the role of trustees, and from our perspective, the critical questions we think trustees should be asking at their campuses when it comes to your role in restoring opportunity in this country. There's another article here around fixing America's affordability problem, but really kind of shifting the conversation around just affordability to this college attainment issue. We have a college attainment problem in this country, and so the pivot has to be there, and at the local level and in your role as trustee, you can have a very direct impact there as well. So as we talk about the data, and I'm going to talk about just kind of presenting the national framework, this is kind of the overview I'll follow. Access, success, affordability, degree attainment, and I'll give you some examples of best practices as well. So before I talk about college access and what's the story here for the past 40 years, there's a couple of things that have been happening. When we compare ourselves to OECD countries, we are essentially fifth in the world in terms of degree attainment, baccalaureate degree attainment. But when we look at our young people, the young population across OECD countries, we drop to 11. So there is a very specific issue there with our younger generations of folks in degree attainment that's related to how we're doing in degree attainment. And you'll see that play out in the rest of these slides. So college going in this country essentially has been going up. And it has been going up for every racial and ethnic group in this country. There's no question about that. And that is a good thing. So it also has been going up for all income groups as well. And I just selectively looked at high income and low income. Now, they have both been increasing, but we still have remaining gaps. We have remaining gaps between black and white, and we can see that actually Latinos in the last several years have actually made incredible gains in college access. So I just want to remind you, this is just access. These are the number of students from high school that attend college the following fall, in October essentially. So we're just looking at the access piece. On the low income side, or on the income side, I think you can see where I draw those arrows that although low-income students are going to college in larger numbers, you see that they're just above attending college at rates that high-income students attended back in 1975, right? So 40 years earlier. So we still have a lot of work to do, certainly making gains, but a lot of work to do. So what about these graduation rates? Well, a typical measure is a 6-year baccalaureate rate. Certainly that's a reporting measure, compliance measure. We report that to the federal government. As we look at these rates, we can see that there's also gaps here in terms of graduation rates as well among different groups. We look at community college graduation rates. This is the 3-year graduation rate, so again, 150% time. We also see that there are gaps there as well. So before I pivot to this access to college at what cost, the other thing we should keep in mind about college access is that I started with all racial ethnic groups and all income groups are actually going to college at record numbers, more than ever before. There's also a question of where they're actually going to college. And a lot of low income, black, Latino in particular, tend to enroll at community colleges and for-profits. And these are institutions where they've struggled and continue to struggle in terms of getting those certificates and or transferring to a 4-year to get that baccalaureate degree. In the case of the for-profits in particular, not only do they struggle to graduate, but oftentimes they don't graduate and they're saddled with enormous debt. So it's just something to keep in mind as well. So access to college at what cost? By this chart, simply just to show you that low-income students still have to come up with a sizable share of their income to cover the cost of college. We're talking about 80% at all these different types of institutions. So I think we know the story in terms of college costs. This is just another way to depict it. We can clearly see that college tuition and fees outpace other consumption goods, notably health care, medical care, of course median family income, and it's increasing at about 5 times the rate of inflation. So over this time period. So what explains all of this? Certainly there are young people that come from schools where, again, we know that the quality is not there for a number of reasons, or low resource schools, teachers don't have certificates or certified to teach in the content area, and there's a number of reasons for that. But I think, we're also to blame with respect to our policies and how we've shifted our policies and our commitments to low-income students in particular, and Black and Latino students that are in those types of schools. Let's talk about the Pell Grant. Pell Grant has been a mainstay for a long time for low-income students across this country that has helped enable them to go to college and mitigate the cost of college. At one point, the Pell covered upwards of, 3/4 of the costs. Now it covers less than a third, and this has actually been shifting in the last several years, where just 2-3 years ago it was actually 2/3, now we're down to 29%. Same thing has happened with respect to states. At one point, states actually earmarked their dollars for 100% need-based aid. That has shifted too, as what has cut into that share is merit-based aid as well. So what about degree attainment? Well, this is where we see gaps. And if you remember that college access, college going, blacks actually, or Latinos actually, access college at higher rates than blacks. When we look at the attainment rates, the opposite is true. So we can see these gaps still exist. And in the case of Latinos and whites, for example, we're talking about 2 times the rate, that gap. And about 1.5 times compared to black students. So these are the gaps that we're talking about. Access, great. The rates are increasing, but we still have equity gaps that we need to close. And you'll see where your role comes in very directly here. We also have gaps by income, big gaps there, you can see that. For those at minority serving institutions, particularly HSIs, I just put this slide out here just as an opportunity. You know what the enrollment growth looks like at your institutions in this state and across the country. A lot of it driven by Latinos and Asians. But this is going to have an impact here. And for those of us that are very much concerned in increasing certificates and baccalaureate rate attainment, this is an area that we can focus on for those of you at those types of institutions as well, have a direct impact there. If we want to move the needle, we need to make sure that these students at these types of institutions succeed. So really, briefly, I just wanted to put out some best practices out there, and some of these might be familiar to you. If not, that's okay too, because through the Partnership for College Completion, we'll spend a little bit more time going over this. But essentially, it comes down to, in the advising area, comes down to the data analytics and math intervention, and we'd like to call that course redesign. The advising is key because we know a lot now about what the best practices and high impact practices around how to best advise students, how to be intentional about that advising, how to steer them in the right direction, how to create programs, degree programs that make sense, are logical, and the students can map out so that they kind of get a better sense of that time to degree and what it's going to take. The data analytics, we don't need sophisticated predictive analytics kind of software here. We can do that on our campuses today with an Excel spreadsheet. What matters is what data our institutions are actually looking at, and we're going to hope to provide you with the type of information and data you need. Developmental math. There's a lot of different ways to do developmental math that are much more effective today than they were yesterday. It's no longer effective, nor is it wise, nor cost efficient to have students take the same remedial education course, developmental course, and only to fail 3 times, and nobody look at the data that student's failing 3 times. It's costly to the institution, the taxpayer, and the student. So we have a lot better ways to handle that as well. What kind of data should we track? This is just a quick sample of the type of data we should track. So I put retention rates on there, and that's a typical one. But beyond retention rates, if we dig underneath, what's even more important and more predictive as to whether or not a student is actually going to graduate in a timely fashion or graduate at all is credit accumulation. That's that metric 2, just as an example. Drop withdrawal failure. It's super important to understand where most of our students are enrolling, where most of your students are enrolling at your institutions. And we can just look at a cut of where the majority of those students are attending, enrolling, and look at the numbers of who have those DFWs, drop failures, withdrawals. Why? Because as we know from the data, those are very predictive in whether or not folks are going to graduate at all. So these are areas we should really be looking at and impress upon our leaders at our institutions to look at this data. Developmental math success, I mentioned that. It's important to look at that. How are students succeeding or not succeeding in these developmental ed courses? So with that, I think this is a good time to open it up for questions and answers, given that we have other partners coming up here to speak. I'll take any question. Yeah.
So if you had a look at, and if you can give us like 2 things or 3 things that we should be focused. Thank you. I'll sing some show tunes now. If you can think of 1 or 2 things that we could be doing as trustees, I mean, you've given us a lot of information and material, but would it be number 1, number 2? What should we be trying to do here?
Yeah, so the number 1 and the number 2, I would say, which is why I presented the credit accumulation. But let me back up. Probably the number 1 would be that DFW piece. Understand where the largest number of students are enrolling. These are usually going to be your, your English 101s and your kind of introductory level courses, and understand what those failure rates are. Why? Because then this is going to tell you who's teaching those courses and how effective they are in those courses. If these students are not succeeding in these courses, it's very hard to move on through the university. The second part of it is a credit accumulation. It's no longer enough to just know that we have 80-90% retention rate. What does that mean in and of itself? It doesn't matter if we have a 90% retention rate if the average student is only taking 10-12 units, which we consider full-time, right? When we look at the research on this, it's much more, what's more predictive is how many units they've actually taken in that first year. And we can break this down, freshman year to sophomore year, sophomore to junior, et cetera. So DFW, drop, failure, withdrawal rates, number 1. Number 2, credit accumulation. Yes.
Thank you. So in the student success practices, you highlight specifically re-examination of drop, withdrawal, hold, registration policies, and course scheduling. What should we be looking for when we're re-examining those policies?
Very good. So one of the biggest complaints that students have all across this country is that they're not able to enroll in the courses that they need to actually, particularly prerequisites, right? So we tend to blame the students typically when they're not performing at the levels at which we want them to perform. But this is a great opportunity for our institutions and our leadership to take a step back and examine the policies at the institution and see if we're causing those challenges and problems for those students. That's what I mean by the reexamination. And we've, in working with universities across the country, when they've actually re-examined it, they have the aha moments. Oh, we've been causing that problem inadvertently. That's what I'm talking about. Great question.
Student success challenges in the state or in the nation. So what we wanted to do is to really synthesize that into really a comprehensive narrative about what's happening in the state of Illinois from a policy perspective, and what's happening from a funding perspective, and what's happening from a graduation perspective for students in Illinois, but particularly for low-income students in Illinois. And before we did that, though, we wanted to zoom out a little bit and look at, just higher education in Illinois by the numbers, and looking really at the scope of the challenge and really the scope of the opportunity in this state to really impact significantly the lives of young people. So we know, of course, we have 48 two-year institutions in this, public institutions in the state, 12 four-year public institutions enrolling about 400,000 undergraduates. So it's a staggering number of students for our state. And so we think about what's the potential of our state if we are to incrementally improve the college completion rates for these 410,000 students. And moving that rate from what's right now around 59, around 60%, how do we move that? What's the benefit to our state when we move that number up, and move that number up by actually raising the graduation rates for the students that are graduating at the lowest amounts right now? So one of the questions we wanted to understand then is affordability. Can our students afford college? And this won't be a shock to obviously anyone in this room that has had to make the tough decisions in recent years around affordability and around tuition and fees. And really, I was really pleased to catch a part of Mr. Berger's presentation that took this analysis even farther back to the early 90s and understand how decisions that were made in the policy arena in the early 90s had direct bearing and direct implication on the fact that we now live in a state where post-secondary education is no longer affordable for low-income students and their families. And so we know that our state public universities are unfortunately increasingly out of reach for all students, but especially out of reach for students in our lowest income quintile. Although we know that our community college system, though, remains relative value, and I say relative here, and we'll get into some of the details on that in just a second. In terms of our community college affordability, you'll see that Illinois here ranks almost a little bit higher than the national average, which is around $3,250 per year. Illinois tuition for community colleges is around $3,890 per year. So Illinois slightly above the national average, but obviously significantly less than the folks all the way on the right on this chart. Troubling, though, is the degree to which Illinois community college tuition and fees are increasing faster than the national average. National average being about 11%. Now, mind you, this data is it's from 2016. It was published in 2017, but it was from 2016. So this is really in the first year of the budget crisis in this state. So we expect that obviously when the College Board, and these data come from the College Board, when they update these numbers this fall, we suspect that this number will actually increase even more. So Illinois is slightly outpacing the national average of how fast tuition is growing in community colleges. You all know, though, that the four-year rate is not as encouraging. Illinois being average tuition and fees ranking 5th highest in the nation. Only Vermont, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania have an average higher public university tuition than the state of Illinois. And what's interesting here is if you look down at the bottom at the rate of increase, it's only 7%. Which is about the national average. And this is over a period of over 5 years. So what this tells you is this has been a slow problem, and it's been a problem that we say it's a bipartisan problem. This is not a Democrat, this is not a Republican problem. This is a problem that both parties have agreed to disinvest in our higher education system, in our four-year institution system, resulting in this level of tuition that quite frankly is just unsustainable. And you heard Mr. Berger talk about the degree to which we know students are out migrating from the state of Illinois. Only New Jersey, only the state of New Jersey out migrates more students than the state of Illinois. And we know the trend is not promising. And Veronica, to your question, I think this really begs the larger question of if we have a policy and a finance environment in this state that has made it very difficult for us to attract students, then how do we make sure that we change the calculus around actually thinking of persistence and completion as a revenue source, in a sense? And it's one that I really appreciate, and I think that that's a way for us to begin to frame this discussion a little bit differently. This next chart is, again, sort of very in a sort of longitudinal way looking at this state disinvestment in higher education. but also looking at the pension cost, which again, many of you know, really the pension cost in higher education exploding really in the last few years, and while state revenue to higher education has decreased. So I wanted to understand what does this look like on a personal level? So and what you see here is the MAP award being relatively flat, and we're very excited and very pleased that in this last budget cycle, the Illinois legislature did actually increase the budget for the appropriation for the MAP award by 10%. So it's a positive first step. But if you look at this chart, you see obviously the ways in which tuition and fees have far outpaced the amount of available aid for low-income students. And so I wanted to understand this from a very personal perspective. And when I enrolled in SIU Carbondale in 1991, I was a maximum Pell student. Received the maximum Pell Award, received the maximum MAP Award, received the maximum SEOG Award at SIUC. And if I were that student today, receiving a maximum on each one of these, I would be eligible for about $5,000 in MAP Award, be eligible for about $6,000 in Pell, and if the institution had enough, I'd be eligible for about $2,000 in SEOG, which would net me about close to $13,000 of need-based aid. And so you say, all right, $13,000 would work, except for when you look at the total cost of attendance at SIUC right now, you see that number's around $25,000. So I'd be short about $13,000 every year as a low-income student. Now, maybe SIU might be able to kick in a little need-based aid and a little bit of a discount for me that might get me a couple $1,000s. Nonetheless, I'd probably be looking at least a $10,000 shortfall. And what did my shortfall look like in 1991? $186 a year. That's how much I had to pay out of my pocket as a low-income student. I'd have to find $186, so what, $93 per semester is what would be left on my bursar bill as a full-time student living in the dorms. So you could see that if I were that student today, if I were the same student going to SIUC, that would be asking me to pay $13,000 a year. Is a little bit like asking, you may as well ask me to write a check for $100,000. I just can't do it. Perhaps I'd be willing to take out some student loans, and I would. I'd be willing to invest in myself. I don't know if I'd be willing to take that big of a gamble on myself. Probably $8,000 or $9,000 or $10,000 a year in student loans. So it's not a coincidence, obviously, then that when it comes to low-income students, if there is another institution across the border, and you could choose a border, really, any one of our borders, that is coming along to myself as a low-income student and saying, you can come to Missouri, and your cost to go to Missouri is going to be a fraction of that $13,000, why wouldn't I go? If it were the University of Indiana or IU that was coming in, sort of making that same case to me, why wouldn't I go? So we know that by policy, really, we've made higher education less affordable to students in the state of Illinois.
Hey, Kyle, can you go back
Sure.
2 slides? What, if you talk about other states, maybe it's that one or one after, about,
This one?
maybe it's the one before that. So well, let me ask you this one. Forget the data, not the data, the charts. Where are we, when you talk about what we spend on quote higher ed and factor in our pension costs, what are other states' pension cost obligations, generally speaking, relative to us?
Yeah. So we haven't done a sort of a comparison across the states, but I've done a little bit of digging into this. And Illinois is, I don't want to say on the extreme, but we are on the higher end of our of states in terms of their pension obligations. Again, I haven't done enough analysis to sort of know, we're 13th or we're 12th, but we're clearly, at least from the available, what I've found on this, and part of this is just also a matter of availability of the data. And one of the things that we're kind of beginning to think about as we develop and craft a policy policy agenda is this, we can't get around this pension obligation. Like, we can't have substantive discussions in our state legislature without understanding the need for serious pension reform. I mean, if you look at where our pensions are in the state of Illinois right now, when you add what we're spending on our community colleges and our four-year institutions, our pension obligations are eating up about a third of that appropriation, maybe a little bit more in this last year. And so Illinois is an outlier. I don't know how far of an outlier quite yet, but it's a good question, Tom, and it's one that we've been thinking about because it will inform any serious discussion about how to restructure this or how to, rethink this rather.
And I'm going to dwell on it, but I guess it
Yep.
would be interesting, when you factor it all in, what our General Assembly spends on higher ed, including pensions relative to what other states spend, are we still below where we need to be?
Right,
Or they come along with it, remember the General Assembly said, wait a minute, we're spending $3 or $4 billion, and that's
Right.
the same as other states. I'm just curious where that is.
Yeah.
I'm not picking one side or not, I'm just curious about where it all fits, because that pension number is, as you just said, very, very significant.
Yeah, and so I think that's a good question, Hyman. We'll dig into that data because I think that is really, that's the question. It's really relative to where, not only sort of relative to what other states are doing on the pension front, but then other states actually then investing investing directly into the kind of programmatic things that are going to improve outcomes. But there's no way around that. There's no way around that green line there.
And my last question is, relative to other states, do other states have a math-like program?
Yeah.
And where do we fit in
Yeah.
that world?
Many states have a MAP program, and at one time, Illinois' MAP program was the sort of class of the nation. And you think back to, I think, what Jay was saying around 2002. Our tuition and fees, obviously, in this state were very much pegged. So in Carbondale, my tuition and fees in 1991 were such that MAP would basically cover my tuition and fees. And that was true all the way through to the early 2000s. But most states have some type of need-based aid. Few were as generous as the state of Illinois up until around 2002. Now more states are far more generous than the state of Illinois. And we can look to our neighbors even directly to the east of us in Indiana that have really prioritized access by providing much more need-based aid and more scholarship opportunities from their state higher education commission. So there's a tremendous amount that we need to be thinking about in this regard. Running out of time here, so I want to just kind of get through some of the access questions that Jose Luis had brought up earlier, and knowing that, as he mentioned, African American students and Latino students are overly represented in our community college and for-profit sectors. And of course, most of you know the pretty precipitous decline of African American enrollment in the state higher education system. And this again comes from the IBHE's Underrepresented Groups report that really looked at enrollment numbers for African Americans. And so we wanted to actually then understand pull this number apart and see what is happening with African American enrollment in this state, given that it's been about a 25% decline over a 4-year period. So we wanted to, and then also look at it over time. We went back to some old IBHE Underrepresented Groups reports and found a number from 1990 that was around 62,000 students. And so what we see then is a sort of increase of African American enrollment and then obviously a tapering off at a time when we're not graduating significantly fewer African American students from high school. So, one of the questions that I know Governor State, for instance, has done some work around looking at what is happening to African American students who don't enroll in their institution. And at Governor State, the biggest destination for African American students that don't enroll in their institution is nowhere. So it's a troubling phenomenon that we have to pay attention to. So, in community colleges, we see this is where obviously the steepest declines of African American enrollment have been over the last, 4 years, roughly about a 30% decline for African Americans over that period, specifically in community colleges, significant but slowing enrollment growth for Latino students. In public universities, you see steep enrollment declines for white students over this period, and about a 10% decline of African American students over the same period. In private colleges, so one of the questions said, well, what if, well, maybe African American students are just enrolling in our private colleges? Didn't see that. We didn't see a sort of increase. In fact, we see about a 10% decline of African American enrollment in our private institutions as well, although a pretty steep increase of Latino enrollment in our private institutions. And then finally, we looked at for-profit institutions, and we see really significant declines for white and African American students over that same period. We did look at what we wanted to understand is the slight uptick that happened in 2014-2015, was that continuing? And the numbers, actually, when we looked at IBHE numbers from 2016, we saw another kind of dip in the for-profit sector. And finally, obviously the reason we exist is to really make a concerted effort alongside and partnering with other folks around in this room and others to look at completion for African American, Latino, low-income students. And so nationally, we know the graduation rate, as Jose mentioned, was around 59% for bachelor's, around 32% for two-year degrees. And while the national graduation rates for African Americans and Latinos have been climbing, the completion gap persists. And we'll get to those gaps in just a second here. We know by income, sort of across race, by income, 37% of low-income students graduating within 6 years versus 75% within 6 years over that same period. And finally, well, not finally, there's a couple more slides here, but one we want to look at is the Illinois graduation rate by race from different ethnic groups. And so we know that our white students are slightly outperforming the national average. So national average for white students is around 63%. In Illinois, it's around 66%. For two-year colleges, the national average is around 33%, and for white students, it's around 36% or 35.7%. For African Americans, on the other hand, the national average is around 41% versus around 34% for African Americans in our four-year institutions, and 25% within the federal amount of time for two-year institutions versus in Illinois, it's 17%. In Illinois, our Latino students are just also a bit behind the national average, graduating at about 54%. The national average is around 54%, and our Latino students graduating at about 49% rate within 6 years. And in community colleges, 33% versus in Illinois, it is 24%. And we also wanted to understand if there are significant differences across sectors. One of the things that you often hear in this space is, when we talk to our college access partners, they say, well, we just need to get students to private colleges. And what you see is for African American students, there's not a significant difference between where students are graduating in terms of four-year public versus four-year private. In our four-year public institutions, African Americans are graduating at about 36% within that federally determined period, and with our private institutions, African Americans are graduating at about 40%. So this myth of the private institutions just doing significantly better for African American students, it just does not play out, obviously, in the data. Perhaps the group that sees the biggest bump in terms of the private college enrollment and graduation are Latino students who graduate at about a 50% rate from our four-year publics to about 57% rate for our four-year private institutions. So then looked at your institutions, the institutions in this room, and looked at the completion gap, or the gap between your federally determined graduation rates and the rates for our underrepresented minorities. And you see really across the board that this gap and these issues persist at all of our institutions. The next slide here really disaggregates that data and looks by race and ethnicity. So it's a lot of information here. I'm going to let you sit with it for a second. We're looking at different races and ethnicities within our higher education institutions in Illinois. So what you'd want to see, obviously, is you'd want to see everybody clustered at the top, right, with a very high completion rate and all groups achieving at that very high completion rate. But what you see really is across the state that no one's really doing that. And there are some great, if you look at Western as an example of an institution that you see all groups are pretty, they're relatively close to one another, not a huge gap between any of the ethnic or the diverse groups there, but you see wildly divergent graduation numbers by ethnicity, and this is all, and we can give this all to you electronically as well, because I think the black and white doesn't capture, obviously, the nuance here that exists between significant gaps for African American students at most institutions and where white students are graduating. Finally, implications for policy and for practice. We know that eliminating these persistent racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps must become a public priority for all of us, not just obviously the folks in this room, but for folks in business, folks in philanthropy, folks in K-12, folks in across sectors. Eliminating those achievement gaps has to become a public priority. And to your point, Veronica, if we think about closing that gap from an economic imperative at our institutions, if we're able to improve outcomes for African American students at our institutions, it also supports your bottom line at the institutions. And ensuring an affordable and efficient path for all students through college must be an explicit goal, really, of higher ed policy across this state, in Springfield and on individual campuses. And I should say, pause here to say that we've spent a lot of time with a number of higher education leaders, public leaders, and from private institutions as well, and really have been strongly encouraged by the great support that they have for closing these achievement gaps and the work that's already taking place at Governor State, at Western, at ISU, et cetera. We have to think about how do we do more of that, do it at a faster rate, and how do we do more of that, and how do we lock arms with our executives who are leading this work and make sure that they're well supported to close these achievement gaps. And then finally, we have to understand a little bit more about what's happening with particularly African American students in the state and what the sort of what's happening with them that's leading them to not only choose to not enroll in our four-year institutions and two-year institutions, but in some cases not enroll at all. So I'll pause here for several questions.
Have you done any research on what the leading causes are of completion rates or lack of completion rates, and how those are spread, or how they're in each socioeconomic group or racial group you were talking about?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is often that type of research relies on survey data. Because you have to obviously be able to catch a student afterwards and say, why didn't you complete, or what led? And so there's a couple of things that the survey data often point to. First is obviously finance. I mean, money is a bit, and that's across sectors. That's in two-year institutions, although it's a little bit different in two-year institutions than in four-year institutions. Two-year institutions, the financial question tends to shake out around me meeting other external obligations, that might have been the reason I chose to stay home and go to a community college in the first place. I might be helping out at home, and me balancing my work and studies just is very difficult for me to do. And in the four-year sector as well. And then the issue tends to become, can I meet my bursar? Can I pay my bursar bill? So all the research says that finance is a significant barrier. then one of the things that we're actually doing and leaning in on is this sense of belonging. Do our first generation low-income students feel like they belong on campus? So we're actually working with Northern and also UIC and in the College Transitions Collaborative to develop an intervention to be piloted in first-year seminars that would help increase a student's sense of belonging. So the sense of, do I actually belong in this place, or am I an imposter here, in spite of the fact that I got in? This question sort of resonates with students around, do I actually belong here? And then what you often then see is many other factors. In the community college space, there's often this thing around remediation. How long am I sitting in remediation? It's not quite as prevalent in four-year institutions, but you have students that will have to take 4, 5, or 6 courses in remediation before they actually can move into credit-bearing courses, and then what kind of impact that has on a student, not only psychologically, but even financially, when that student is essentially taking an extra year of courses that are not credit-bearing before they can even actually enter the track. So there's a range of issues that are leading students to not complete. And so, again, there's lots of good survey data out there, and that's something that we want to kind of understand a little bit more, even from a qualitative perspective across the state.
Trustee, if correlation is strong across racial groups, that was all presented in racial groups, that's related to income, then we need to be addressing that, and it would be more effective than trying necessarily to address things specifically by race. If it's not correlated with financial circumstances across racial groups, then we need to come up with more targeted.
Well, and I think that sort of speaks to Jose Luis's point about sort of you're in the position to ask for that kind of data from your institution. You're in the position to be able to say, we'd love to understand what is happening for students in terms of remediation. Are we seeing that there are any differences between the way low-income white students are sitting in remediation versus low-income African American students? And really, you have that ability to sort of understand that and pull those questions apart. We have probably time for one more, and then Lisa's going to wrap up. Go ahead, sure.
What it speaks to is the connection between higher ed and K-12.
Yes.
You make a decision in higher ed to enroll these students with the idea that they would be successful, and we have to make sure we communicate what that anticipated success in terms of outcomes really is, and how can we enable the high schools from which these students come to ensure that these students will be successful when they get. So it's a partnership between the high school, K-12, and university. The university can't stand away from the K-12. They have to be working together to get success of the students.
And that's right. And it's also a partnership between our four-year public institutions and our community colleges, and how are folks working to make sure that those transitions are seamless between not only high school to our four-year, but also two-year to four-year. And again, I will sing Elaine Mayman's praises around the dual degree program there that is really working alongside those community college partners in the region to make sure that those students have a clean, smooth, successful transition into their junior year status at Governor's State. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Castillo to wrap us up.
Well, maybe not for now, but how do you graduate, come on up there, how do you graduate in 4 years if you spend half a semester on remediation for a year? I mean, it's just doesn't work.
That's right, and there are some really, and that's right, and there are some promising practices out there around. For instance, we talked to some community colleges that are doing their developmental math classes in the senior year of high school. So and again, there's practices out here that folks are doing that get at some of these big questions. But you're absolutely right, and so we have to think about how do we elevate those practices, and then how do we sort of stand behind our executives to implement those practices, and when they are, make sure that they're sort of moving those practices ahead for large numbers of students.
Hello, my name is Lisa Castillo Richmond. I'm the Director of Strategy. I work with Kyle at the partnership. I'm here to leave you with a few actionable items, strategies, and recommendations. Some of you have requested those, and I think you'll find them helpful in moving forward, thinking about some of the data that's been shared with you today, national and state level. We wanted to give you a chance to have some discussions at your tables, but in the interest of time, we're going to skip over this. Instead, I hope that you can take some of these questions in your deck and maybe open a dialogue with your fellow trustees at your respective institutions to talk about what is already happening within them. What we've seen in our many conversations across the state with 2- and 4-year institutions is that many of these change practices, implementing national evidence-based practices, are happening in pockets across the state. Many different practices are being implemented, and so I think you'll find some of that when you go back to your institution. I want to leave you with a few strategies and recommendations in these final thoughts, just to kind of drive home some of the points made by both Jose Luis and Kyle. It is no longer enough for us to simply focus on college access and opportunity. Institutions and their respective campuses must focus their attention on success. Why? Well, because students can't just get by in this economy, regional or otherwise, with some college, or with no college. We need to be thoughtful and helpful to them in getting them the degrees that will allow them to thrive. It's important for trustees to ensure that their institutional leaders put into place a bold vision, strategy, and goals around these issues to enhance existing student success and performance. It's no longer enough to have institutional data systems and institutional researchers that use data for reporting and compliance purposes only. Institutions must look for ways to improve their data capturing capabilities in order to drive decision-making to improve student success. Adding a first-year experience or a multicultural center or learning communities may be necessary, but not sufficient to realize improved results. What is needed is a core set of values of student success, or a culture of completion on campuses that is broadly felt throughout the university in order to move the needle on existing patterns of student success. At the center of driving continuous improvement for student success is institutional data. Successful leaders at successful institutions use data to mobilize action. Institutions need leadership from trustees, from presidents and provosts to inculcate a culture of intentionally improving data and its use for enhanced student success. There are several strategies that can be used in this pursuit to create this culture, to put you on the path to increase student outcomes that trustees can use to impart with their institutional leadership now, many of which are poised and taking action on these fronts already. If your institution hasn't already done so, encourage leadership to launch a campus-wide improvement effort. That is, to use the data to call your institutional community to action in order to address and remove any obstacles to student success. I am confident that your individual institutional data will help you articulate a compelling story in order to inspire those within the campus community who are ready to roll up their sleeves or who are already doing so and take the next step in improvement efforts. Here, you can insist that institutional leadership describe the gaps in performance between groups. So for example, does income really explain all of those racial achievement gaps within your institution? To improve retention rates, to help students accumulate credits more quickly, and to ultimately raise graduation rates. To look at how these trends have or have not changed over time within your respective institutions. Also, to insist that institutional leadership describe what is happening around those courses that generate the largest number of drops, fails, withdrawals, and incompletes every year. Because these metrics have implications for time to degree, for overall graduation rates, and course redesign opportunities. Model behavior at the top. Consequential decisions should be based on evidence, particularly those decisions that affect students' lives. That is why it is important for trustees, through their oversight responsibilities, to demand that institutional leadership embrace the use of data for decision-making. And we emphasize that this is already happening in many different places. This is behavior that you should want to impart on others throughout your university community, through the leaders that you entrust to lead your institutions long after any one of you leaves your position. It is important for trustees to request and use the data, rolling up your sleeves and digging into it, disaggregating it in different ways, looking for insights about both problems and potential solutions, and again, looking at those trend lines over time and how they may have changed from year to year. This level of engagement with the data ensures that conversations about campus structures and policies require the use of the insights generated from the data and not just the data itself. Encourage that your institutional leadership engage the campus community as problem solvers, as organizational improvement doesn't happen only at the top or in a vacuum. In complex organizations like universities, especially possibly in universities, successful organizational improvement efforts engage everyone, including faculty, staff, deans, and department chairs. Oftentimes, increasingly, we're seeing this also engage students directly in owning this work. A provost is key in championing efforts to engage people throughout the campus to own, analyze, and act on their own data. As a trustee, you want to ensure that your institution has accessible, accurate, and effective data delivery. Nowadays, there are many different data systems and solutions and dashboards and scorecards. What does your strategic plan say within your institution? What are the data tools at your disposal? How are you using them? Can you get access to this data and on what timeline? What works for well-prepared students, we have seen, does not necessarily work for first-generation college students. With the student body that's changing, we must be responsive to student needs for us to succeed in our continuous improvement efforts at all our universities. Trustees should know the data on how well first-generation college students, low-income students, students of color, veterans, part-time students, and other groups are performing. Trustees should know what unique challenges these student populations face and how they are being addressed to improve student performance overall. Essentially, it is key for trustees to embrace a culture of data and evidence to build new insights, to improve efforts, and encourage change across the university. So what are these 6 actionable recommendations we want to leave you with? Number 1, request your institutional student success vision, strategies, and goals. What is the scorecard? What is the dashboard? What is being used? How is it built into the strategic plan? Are there disaggregated goals for different student groups? Should there be? What do these look like? How have these changed over time? Look at them often and update them regularly. Number 2, request the practices. What practices are being utilized to improve student performance? What evidence do they have of success, and what evidence do they have of success on your campus? How have they moved the needle? Who are they being used with? Is there an opportunity to scale these practices to serve more students? If these practices aren't being used, what can you do to deploy them more broadly across the campus? 3, request to know what your institution's year-to-year retention data look like for different students groups. We know that college leaders do not change 4- or 6-year graduation rates by focusing on the graduation rates. They focus on incremental progress. And persistence without progress, without credit accumulation, is meaningless. So how are students accumulating credits over the course of the years and persisting successfully toward graduation? Number 4, request to know and focus on your 4-year graduation rate. We all know in this community, although many outside of the higher ed community don't know, that we typically report now on a 6-year time frame for 4-year institutions. You should also be looking at 4-year time frame and looking at how this has changed over time. This will save students and institutions and the state money. We should track it and request that your institution do something about it. Number 5, request to know if key folks throughout the institution have access to the same real-time data in order to make real-time and consequential decisions for students. So how is data disseminating across the campus, especially for anyone who touches students directly? Do people have the data they need to make key and important decisions in real time every day? And finally, request to know how your institution is spending its institutional dollars. More and more institutions have diverted need-based aid to merit-based aid. Know what your distribution is, and also know how low-income students' net price compares to higher income students? Is the cost burden shared in an equitable way? We thank you so much for your time today and hope you will consider the Partnership for College Completion a thought partner and an action partner, a partner for research and data, to help you think about this work that you're doing every day with your college university leadership, all the staff, all the faculty, and your students. So thank you for your time today, and we look forward to engaging you in the months and years to come.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to finish up with the conversation among trustees. So 5 minutes, we'll start back in literally no more than 5 minutes. Thanks, Kyle. And team. All right, we're almost there. So I want to thank the folks here from IBHE, Cindy and Jamie and Candace. You guys raise your hand. I think everybody knows who they are. They, along with the rest of the staff at IBHE, could not wait and are so excited about tomorrow, where there's actually, or Wednesday, an interim, or in my opinion, executive director. They've had to deal with me for the last year. So that's why they're all smiling back there. But I want to thank them for all the work that they did. Look, I don't want to say struggle, but I don't know what works or what doesn't work for events like this, for retreats like this. But we want to make your lives easier. We want to be helpful. We want to be productive. We all get caught up in our day-to-day lives and in our roles as trustees. And, well, we got FOIA, we got open meeting, we've got tuition, we've got the budget, and da-da-da. And you are all to be commended for what you do, because, and not to sound corny, but it's true, you really literally make a difference in students' lives, whether it's one student or thousands. And you really are to be commended for what you do. And I, on behalf of IBHE, I say thank you for what you do. And as I said, we want to make your lives easier. We want to be productive. We want to be helpful to you. So what we're going to do this afternoon is, for the next hour, we're going to talk about what you want to talk about. We're going to listen to what your concerns are, what your needs are, what your wants are. So, and the program, we had Mary Pat was going to facilitate this, but we've changed. I made an executive decision, sorry, Cindy, but I'm going to somewhat moderate, and Mary Pat and Al Bowman, who's going to be our new executive director, are going to help answer questions along with me. Everyone from the three from IBHE, we're going to be taking notes, and we're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So I wrote down, and none of this needs to be discussed. You guys are going to bring up what you want. You can talk among yourselves, as far as I'm concerned. And I say that in the most positive way. We talked, this is just what's come to me from this morning. One of the topics was, how can IBHE do better in the area of metrics? What are the metrics we ought to be collecting? How should we share it? How should it be presented? Should it be in 1,000 pages? Should it be in 5 pages? We may very well have some questions following up on Mary Pat's conversation from this morning, and those questions will drive you crazy, and there's nobody to answer those better than she. Someone talked to me about, if you're on this, and you're on an ISU board, but you're on other boards, where's your commitment and where's your advocacy and loyalty? Is it the ISU board, or is it on that other board? And I don't pick on ISU, I just happen to see Bob Dobsky here, but it can be anybody. And those questions, and are you a fiduciary, you're an advocate, those types of questions. I think there's someone asked me about the issue of free speech and how you handle that. We talked a little bit about, at lunch and then afterwards, the whole issue of kind of debunking the myths that exist in higher ed, maybe around the country, but specifically here in Illinois. So with that, I have, and they don't even know it, 2 microphones for Mary Pat and Al, and I'm going to give them each a microphone, and I'm going to have one, and we'll start the conversation. I know there are no shy people in this room. Whoever wants to start, go right ahead. Yep, go.
No, you're just going to have to yell.
Okay, I'll yell. So I'm just kind of curious. I'm new to the board at NIU, and as I went through and we went through orientation, I asked every member of all of our areas of, if you could be king or queen for a day, what's the one thing you would do and the 2 things you would do? And 100% of the
Anyone else want to jump in on procurement? We had a procurement bill that passed that the universities weighed in on heavily, and I think most everybody would say we have a long way to go, but there was some movement on it. But again, I don't want to, this is not my conversation. Anyone else have procurement concerns?
First of all, is it true that the community colleges do not have to follow the procurement laws? That is true. So why do we have to follow them? But there are 17, it's like being a minority board member in a company.
I understand, but they made it so, they made it complex because it was distrust of the way we operate in higher education. I think it's misplaced. I don't think it should have been done in the first place. And it was done under a governor who I also think went to jail. But we need to simplify it. It's costing the universities money.
Do you guys feel the same way at Governor State? Mary Pay, I saw you were going
Well,
to.
I was just going to say that, yes, it applies to you guys because you're state agencies, so you're absolutely correct on that. And there has been a lot of movement on this. If you remember, I was working with the U of I people a while ago in the last legislative session, the 99th General Assembly. Now we're in the 100th, so last year. And actually, the legislative leaders were really onto it. U of I made a very credible argument when they lost a professor who wouldn't come here because he couldn't get the microscope that he needed, some advanced microscope, because if you run it through the frickin' procurement code, the cheaper microscope, you had to buy it. And I'm talking about a microscope that costs $1 million, $2 million. I mean, it was a major piece of equipment. And the scientist said, I'm not going to teach at U of I and bring my research dollars because I have to have the microscope I need, not the microscope that comes under the procurement code. And I will say that the legislative leaders who we met with and we drafted legislation, I forget, Mike Bass, is that the guy's name?
From U of I.
From U of I, he was awesome on this, and he's been pushing it. So I know that they didn't have an appetite for it last year because of all the nonsense that was going on with the budget. But I would suggest highly that we keep pushing, you keep pushing through the IBHE, because there was a very much a recognition and a discussion about carving out the universities and letting you self-police, kind of like we did for the Illinois Medical District. The Illinois Medical District was subject to the procurement code, and we went in and we suggested changes to the Illinois Medical District Act. I represented them, and we got it passed that took us out of the procurement code, but we had to self-police. Like, we still had to do things and kind of put it in our statute, but we were able to dictate what we could do. We could exempt out construction, for instance, which is what the problem was for the Illinois Medical District. We couldn't build anything because we couldn't get through the procurement process. So I would suggest you do it. And then you didn't you and Mark work on that, Tom, this year?
Yes, and we passed a bill that didn't get as far as we'd like, Bob.
You've got a lot of new trustees here, maybe a quick synopsis of what exactly procurement code is.
You want to do that?
Yes, sir. Excuse me.
Let Mary Pat do that.
No, and then Jamie, because Jamie worked on this with Mark from my
That's a good-
office, right?
good
Yeah.
point, Bob.
Okay, right. The Illinois Procurement Code is a set of rules in the code that runs, the lawyers in the room probably know better than me, but it runs like 50 pages of all the rules that you have to follow to do a procurement. And most of the procurements require that it be published in a state newspaper, and sometimes that newspaper is in Streator, Illinois, so it'll have nothing to do with what you're doing, but you still have to publish it in the newspaper. It has to be open for a specific period of time, no less than 21 days or 27 days or something like that. And you have to get all the bids back. You have to have a evaluation process that's spelled out, you know, like how you're going to evaluate, and then you have to generally pick the lowest bidder, unless it's construction, in which case it's lowest responsible bidder. So that's sort of the rules that govern it, so that and the only exceptions to the procurement code are for artistic services, which includes lawyers, which is kind of a joke, but as if we're artistic services. But something, of course, because we drafted it, but it exempts out lawyers or people that, like, you need to hire that have special talent. Like, if you were going to hire a singer for your benefit, you might be able to exempt that out because the singer is special talent. And the other things, the exemptions to the procurement code are if it's under $20,000, which as you know is a pretty low amount for vendors, everything else has to be bid. Under 20, less than a year in duration, and the board specifies that it's an emergency that has to be done.
It's over 20,000. Still, you go through that entire process, and doesn't it still have to be approved by the state procurement officer? I mean, it goes beyond your.
Yeah, and that's where U of I got got frustrated, is that you would go to what the gentleman's referencing is there's a procurement officer for the state of Illinois, and Matt Brown is his name. He's gone now, and he had to go through your whole process, and if he found something he didn't like about your process, you had to redo it, or he wouldn't approve the procurement.
So in essence, when you're buying things, and I think, Larry, if I remember correctly, you were trying to get somebody to food service, and no one wanted to do it. At the end of the day, all you had was that company that had the Grand Slams, right? Denny's? No one else would bid on it because it was so cumbersome. I'm generalized, I don't speak for you. So it's the purchase of food service to microscopes to, maybe not paper clips, and it's become a real pain in the rear end is what everyone's point is. Al, anything you want to add on procurement to this conversation? All right. So there was a bill this year. Jamie, quickly maybe do it. I want to be respectful of time and keep moving. We hear you on it. It's just a matter. It's going to take a group effort and to continue this challenge. But some things were changed this year. The IBHE was helpful. The universities were helpful, and we got some of it done. You want to cover that, Jamie?
I didn't really want to speak particularly to the bill. What I wanted to say is you asked about making an exemption for universities. We tried that. We tried doing that in a couple different avenues, saying if universities were using their privately held funding, non-state dollars, that they would be exempted from the procurement code. The speaker and his staff said, no, absolutely not. We won't allow that. They have a very close relationship with the chief procurement officer for higher education, so that's why as long as the speaker is the speaker, I seriously doubt higher ed will ever completely get out from underneath the procurement code.
I think it's a
As
challenge.
long as-
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I don't think we should give up, but this is a
No.
recurring theme on procurement. So we know, we get that. Now, on civil service, I have heard it on more than one occasion. I assume, do others have concerns on the civil service area? I see Elaine shaking her head, yes. We did not try anything this year, so if you have, what I would argue, or not argue, what I'd suggest is if you have ideas, this one might be a pretty tall lift as well. You might want to get them to Jamie, and we can start putting something together. But I don't want to make any promises on either one of these, but I don't think we should give up, because everyone's got these same issues. Unless you all want Denny's on your campuses, and that's all you're going to get. And I shouldn't even joke about it, because I know it's a problem. All right.
Can I just ask, you said as long as the speaker is Speaker of the House, you don't think it's going to change very much. Can we understand, what the benefit the legislature or the speaker sees to this procurement rules are, so that when you make that, maybe we understand it a little bit? What does the legislature view as the benefit to forcing universities to operate this way?
The reason, and it's popularly known as Senate Bill 51, which was the massive omnibus bill which created the current procurement rules. That was crafted by the Speaker's Legislative Council. So one thing you should know, and Tom knows this well, the Speaker protects his Legislative Council no matter what they do. So because this was her baby, her gem, any changes to it, he has to approve, she has to approve. But because we had so much misconduct under the Blagojevich administration with procurement, circumventing procurement, common sense procurement practices, the GA did what they did as far as going way out. Just like Mary Pat said, they took that bat and they just knocked it out of the park. And so trying to reel that back in takes a Herculean effort, because they say, we've got all this transparency now, we've got all these processes, these checks and balances. So
Yeah, this isn't all the speaker. This would be all four caucuses being afraid that if you started less easing up on procurement rules, that you would be setting up a stage for abuse. So Jamie's right. This was a complete reaction, maybe you would argue overreaction, like College of DuPage, Mary Pat talked about, to the Blagojevich years.
Was there a lot of documented, shenanigans or within this group of universities and procurement?
You want to add any? I'm not sure if I remember any of the specifics.
I don't think there was a lot of shenanigans on the university's part. It was
Yeah.
shenanigans in CMS and in other,
Yeah.
IDOT and in some other areas. We just got kind of folded in when they created the 5 different CPOs.
Elaine?
Yeah, I remember when the law was toughened in 2009, and I think that it wasn't in response to abuses on the parts of the university.
Yeah.
In fact, the university presidents were trying at that time to say, let's look at best practices in other states. Yes, we have to be monitored. We never said that we didn't, but that we needed reasonable ways of being monitored that allowed scientists to have the microscope that they need and so forth. I'll give you another example. Governor State is part of a consortium of community colleges and private universities in the South Suburbs. Every other university in that consortium was able to put together an agreement for a utility purchase that is saving those universities and community colleges thousands and thousands of dollars. Governor State was not permitted to participate in that because of these procurement laws. So there you are.
But the Blagojevich umbrella gets everybody. And what Mary Pat made an excellent point. If you can come up with some legislation that allows for perceived or real policing by a different entity or among yourselves, that's the way you're going to hopefully get something done. I don't speak for you, but that's,
I think you should seriously think about doing it through the IBHE, that you guys should sponsor the legislation on behalf of the universities, because what happened is U of I took the lead on this, and they did a great job. I mean, the team was phenomenal, and I'm telling you, we got buy-in from Heather, who she's talking about, the legislative council, and the speaker's office, but they don't want to look like they're favoring U of I, to tell you the truth. And I couldn't speak on behalf of anybody other than the U of I when we were in the room. And I think if it's a collective problem and a collective solution that everyone's going to buy into, I think you'll get some, maybe some buy-in from the legislature as well.
it's one way to look at it. Let's, yes. Yep. What needs to be done? Help us out. No, this comes up, but I never get specifics on how to fix it. Larry, you had your hand up.
Just piggybacking on what Rachel was saying, I think the issue there is not necessarily legislation, but it's really an interpretation by the civil service agency.
Okay.
That they would take a look at staff positions on our campuses, and there are 2 classifications outside of faculty. One is called administrative professional, and there are fewer of those folks. It's not true in every case, but they tend to be oftentimes the supervisors of the civil service staff. And then there's the civil service definition. Very different criteria used in those positions, and the latitude has been given to the institutions historically to make the definition as to which of those go where. A new interpretation by Judge
Okay, wait, oh, now the hands are, we got a lot, that's good.
It's very complicated, and I think you're overstating what the general counsel said, or at least what he told us in executive session. But there's been a fight filed with the executive Illinois Secretary's office, and we're working to resolve that. Right now, the definition of administrative offensive personnel is a very loose thing, not been approved by the legislature really. So they're trying to tighten that up. But it doesn't necessarily, both of us, he has never said he didn't want to expand the civil service under this bill. What they need is to, come up with a definition that we all can live with. The new chairman of the commission was appointed last, March, I think it was, met with, both the university, civil service people and the human resource people. He's met 4 times. And he's going to be, I think, 3 more times. We're supposed to meet again as a board in December, and we expect pretty much by January or February, we're going to have to come up with some kind of answer to the Secretary General's office, or we're going to go to, he's going to go to the Attorney General's office, and there's really do not want that.
But I think that the challenge is that the general counsel is just trying to represent the trustees so that we do not become liable for any misinterpretation of the law. But my understanding is that the general counsel says there's nothing we can do here because we're just trying to follow the law, right? So fundamentally, the law needs to change, especially during these budget times, right, where it's very difficult to, I think we heard it during lunchtime, where it's all, we almost work on an entirely fixed cost model because it's so difficult to reduce costs, right?
Okay.
And so much of that has to do with the
No, I'm not. Okay.
so I think
Yeah,
it's, the
thanks.
interpretation is creating all sorts of problems, but I think it's rolling out to the actual law that is governing it.
Okay, I'm making notes in this. Anyone else on civil service?
So this is such a complicated issue, and I would just say, for those of you, all of you have a representative on the merit board, and the trustees have to go to the merit board, so one of the issues is that not all of your universities are well represented, your people aren't always showing up, and the other thing is you have to work with your HR people, because they're the ones that are trying to figure out how to ensure that we don't, technically speaking, everybody's in the civil service, except for some positions like president, vice president, or those that can be exempted by the merit board. And so it's really complicated, but the key thing is make sure your representative is going to the merit board and that you're talking to the HR people to understand what is going on, because it's layers and layers deep, and we're not quite representing it accurately here. Honestly, I've spent hours on this. I know several of you have. It's very complicated, but here's the key. If we lose the exemption authority and cannot have APs, all of our universities will lose, because we will all of a sudden have a type of, all of our staff will be civil service. You will not be able to recruit nationally for positions, and you will get into having to use the civil service system to hire for research specialists, advisors for students, people running programs of high quality like master's programs. They're all going to be civil service, and that will be the kiss of death to all of our universities. So this is a really critical issue, and I don't think we're going to solve it here, but I have 2 recommendations. Make sure your merit board people are going to the board meetings and consulting with your HR people so you understand what the implications of all these efforts are on your staffing situation. So,
Okay, fair. All right. Please.
The one thing I don't understand out of all this, and again, I'm new, is when we talk about the community colleges, and it sounds like they're doing better, they're really awesome. How come we have these shackles, I guess, put on us, and they do not? And I'm not trying to have them put on them too, but
I don't know.
it seems crazy.
Anyone have a perspective on that? Elaine?
yes, I understand
And then-
that because
Okay.
part of their revenue is from the local tax base. we are called sometimes state agencies, and then it is imposed upon us to do things that make no sense for universities, but may make sense for state agencies. I think that's behind the issue.
You want anything? All right.
I'll just quickly add on a very happy comment about the board, right? Your organization collectively, in some fashion, taking these issues on our behalf. I think one off, especially when you're like it's a stereotype that it's the favorite child kind of thing. But the reality of it is that we are not public institutions. We're funded maybe a total aggregate by 27 or 20% or something like that from the state. And we're being treated like items kind of thing. So collectively, if we could have a voice through your organization, maybe that's a ginormous way to move.
You'll let us explore them both a little bit. We can, welcome to the executive director spot. And we'll all start wearing orange vests, and you see us as well as the IDOT guys. Okay. Yep. And then we'll try to move on to another topic.
I just wanted to bring up a thank you and a shout out and encourage the IBAG to continue to put out the information about how the state of Illinois is still strong. We've got the best universities
Yeah.
in this part of the country. We're the second highest recruited state. We have recruiters in Illinois, up in the Chicago area, that have been tapped on by 3 different colleges, paying $20,000 or more, just to get our recruiters to become their recruiters, out of Dallas and one out of Denver. Oregon. Yeah, and we need another source, or your advertising or help, to say, hey, Illinois is a place to come to school.
Yep. We're working on that, and I 100% agree with you. We can be a voice for that. I know others, or I know individual schools. Al?
I couldn't agree more. The Illinois public higher ed system has been well regarded nationally for many, many years. Can you hear me?
Yep.
And I think our challenge going forward is dealing with the reputational damage that we've suffered because of the budget. It's going to make faculty recruitment a lot more difficult than it has been. And one of my concerns is, as we recruit senior leadership, the worry about stable funding will chase some very good people away. And, I think the problem is solvable, but it's going to take a long time to repair our collective reputation.
On top of that, you start already hearing rumblings that we may be having another budget impasse or really contentious budget committee coming. We'll be right back where we are. What's the sense in spring?
I don't think anybody, there might be one person, but I would argue no one knows what's going to happen in May of next year.
We may not have a budget until after the November election.
It's possible. I don't think I would not, and I don't know anything either. I would plan that you could go into May, leaving the General Assembly, the session is supposed to be done historically by Constitution by the end of May, that may not happen. There could be a stopgap, there could be a half of funding, there may be nothing till November, but nobody knows. And I think you have to assume that may not be like it was this year. And I'm not trying to be a negative person. I think you have to be realistic that we are in a campaign season, and it began a while ago, and both sides, I stress, both sides are going to be playing politics, and I think we have to plan for the event that there's not a budget, a traditional budget. Yep.
I was on the board of Western in the mid, 2006, when the universities were getting funding from the legislature. So the information that trustees needed wasn't as great as it is now.
Okay.
I think trustees need as much information, as much data as possible because of enrollment issues and because of funding issues. So any information that your agency can provide the trustees, data, trends, whatever, it would be greatly appreciated, I think.
So we put out the bulletin. Candace, how often do you put out the bulletin now? We're back to once? twice a month. Do you all get the bulletin, the IBHE bulletin? You don't? Okay. Well, then we need to figure out, because that usually has a lot of data and a lot of information. It's not a short document. So maybe we can utilize the bulletin going forward to supply some of that and get that to you. Candace, what do we need to do to get trustees on that list, that email list?
I'll get their email addresses from the liaisons, and I will have it added to the list so that they can all start getting it.
All right, and I assume the president, you guys all get the bulletin, don't you? I think one of the questions I have, and so if you don't have it, maybe today's not the day, but the next time we meet, or you could get to us, is what, how, let's be realistic, is everybody going to read it? Some will, some won't. And, do you want 5 dot points? Do you want 50 pages? And I think for us, we need to know, for you guys as trustees and gals, what's the best way to lay out that data and information that you can use, that you can understand, and that makes sense. And we'll start sending all of you that thing, but we need get back to us on how you want it. Because as I'm finding out in the world of higher education, it's real easy to put 100 pages of data into a document, and a lot of people really like that. And it's not that it's not important, but how do you use it? And I said that earlier this day. There's an art and a gift, and it takes time and intelligence on how to pare it down so it's a good document and a workable document. So I'd really like your feedback on that, but we will get you the bulletin. Barbara?
So Tom, I would say the report on out-migration was one of the most impressive reports I've seen IBHE put out. It was compelling, it was easy to understand, it was graphical, and I think legislators pay more attention to that than they have many other things that we keep putting out there. So I said this to the crew when you came to the U of I, but I hope you keep doing that.
Okay.
It doesn't punish any one university, it doesn't drag enrollments in front of people for particular institutions. It says, look, the state is losing talent. And I was so impressed by that. I hope you keep that up. That was a great example
All right.
of collective.
All right, well, fair. I'm good. I want to hear this. Yep.
And we talk about metrics, I think another important one is, we often see the iPad grad rate, but that just does not include so many of the students that we help to graduate. So if we can start looking at graduation data a little differently for the state, that would be great, especially as their transfer, the number of transfer students we have increasing.
Fine. Look, all this, you got to just let us know. We have somebody taking over that knows this world very, very well, and can also tell you whether that makes sense or doesn't. So, and I think you need to know that. So, I got it down on the list. And what else are you missing? You think that you want in terms of data and information? Yes.
Some of my staff constituents told me about administration being top heavy. But what could we as trustees do about that, and how could we tell whether or not it is top heavy and which part of it is heavy?
I think now that maybe we can accumulate that, but I think if you talk to individual presidents, to use the term we had, they would debunk that as a myth that everything's top heavy, financially speaking. I'm looking at Larry and Elaine. I think you probably have the data to suggest otherwise.
IBHE did a study on that and said it's a little old, but it was actually done before the last 2 years of the budget had passed.
Yeah.
And it showed 2 years ago that there were no more administrators in the public universities in the state of Illinois, percentage-wise, than there were any other places in the nation. So that was 2 years ago, and a lot of the folks that lost jobs and so forth get viewed as administrators. The other issue with that, in terms of terms that have been thrown out about administrative flow, the other issue with that is the definition of administrator.
Well, let us look at this. I was before my time, but Candace, you probably have the document that Larry's talking about, the information from 2 years ago. And so maybe we can take a look at updating it. Doesn't sound like it might be easy, but we can at least work on that and see if we can put something together in a fairly uncomplicated manner. I don't know if we can, but let us at least consider it. I know, for instance, Eric Lichtenberger is putting together some data on comparing cost between our schools and the surrounding state and trying to prove and show the data that you hear all this, it's less to go to Missouri and Iowa than here, that there's some data that suggests otherwise. So we're also putting that together.
I was also asking that question, which I think is huge, right? Kind of define how big the headwinds are against us if it costs our infrastructure is so heavy, so burdensome amongst all of our state universities, right? Compared to it's cheaper to produce the widget in Wisconsin or Indiana. That would be helpful, just what you said. But in addition to that, the idea of the pensions cost, right? I think if I'm in the legislature, I'm looking at the cost of higher education, and they're considering that pension piece as well. With my guess is when you throw that in, that we've got to be near the top of the pile. And then it's really, really, really hard for them to come up with a solution. So we're going to increase it, so we're going to invest in our future X% more because we're already over the.
Yeah, look, I think that I'm not sure between MAP and the 4 years in community college, the number is it 2 million? Or so what's there, 3 million? What's the number that appropriated? Ballpark, help me out. In a normal year, what is it? Between MAP and operations? What's the General Assembly appropriate? Back in 15, what was it? Anybody? Was it, what's 1.2? Yeah, and pensions this year is going to be 1.6, 1.7. I mean, so think about that. I'm sorry I was off a little bit, but is it 1.2 is all? Yeah. Yeah, operating. And is MAP above that, or is that part of the 1.2? Yeah. But anyway, to put your point about when you throw in, I think we're at 1.7 on, isn't it about right? Between all sources that come to us, to SERS, what we get from the state. So when the General Assembly says, we gave almost 4 million or 3.5 to higher ed, they don't differentiate, and they should.
But I think the other question too is not just how much it's costing us, but how much is it costing us to graduate somebody, right?
Yeah.
So there is a difference between costing to serve X number of students, but then to graduate.
Yep, I'm putting that down. Okay, what else? We got about 15 minutes in here. Any other topics? Yes?
Learn and sometimes hear about how dead or alive is a concept of performance-based funding. It seems to come and go, but it never really gets focused on. I don't know which way it is right now. Is it coming or going?
Who wants to answer that? It has been coming and going. I think wasn't there a small portion of the budget that had performance-based in it? Half of 1%. Yeah. I think Jamie's going to weigh in on this, but I knew it wasn't much.
Yeah, it was 0.5%, and when the GA passed it, it was in 2013, so it was in effect for 2014, 2015, but then we had the budget impasse. I'm not sure if there's any plans to do it for this coming year, because it's partially based on previous years, so that's the status. It's kind of up in the air. I also know that there have started to be talks at looking at changing the formula that is based on, as well as changing the percentage so that the universities actually, there's a reason to achieve their benchmarks, because 0.5% is a drop in the bucket.
All right. Anyone else on any other topic? Anyone have questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I might ask about our overall financial health, collectively and individually. How strong and stable are we? And what should be kind of targets or benchmarks for working capital? What leverage some of the traditional, you know, if we were an industry, we would all know what the benchmarks for, you know, kind of the medium performers, the high and low performers are. And I think that would be very helpful for us to understand what our reserves should be, what our working capital, what our leverage, those sort of ratios should be, operating costs.
I would say to that, I was with Niall and Candace going around. Niall's our Deputy Director of Finance, and he and all three of us went around to all of the campuses, did our fall budget meetings. So we will be presenting our budget recommendation to the board at the December board meeting, and then once that's approved, that will be out on our website, and that will have capital and all of those type of things for what we are recommending to the governor for a budget for higher education for fiscal year 19.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been sitting here thinking as we're discussing these various topics that are on the list, but I keep coming back to very simplistic thought. We're talking about recruitment for higher administration. We're talking about, because we're not marketable as a state. I keep coming back to, we're discussing the loss of our students, but what are we doing in regards to loss mitigation to, in the minds of our students within the state of Illinois? Because students outside of Illinois are not going to have an interest in coming to Illinois if our students in Illinois are not interested in coming to our university. So how do we approach that as a collective? Because individually, our universities are marketing our target market. We're individually putting funding towards that. But as a state, who has put us in this situation, how can we approach it collectively? I know that was a lot.
I'm just making a note.
I don't know that I could answer the question, but I'd like to take a stab at it.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, I think part of the issue we're dealing with is the changing landscape of higher education in the Midwest. Illinois has been one of the largest exporters of college students for a long, long time. In fact, we've been number 2 for many, many years. Only New Jersey exported more students than Illinois. And, you know, collectively as a state, we didn't worry very much about it because we had a rising number of 18-year-olds. Budgets were stable. And even in years when there were slight declines, we still had budgets universities could plan, and life went forward. What's different today is that the regional public universities can't sustain the scope of operations that they've grown accustomed to. Our regional universities have in many ways begun, over the years, have begun to emulate the flagships. And so regional public universities all over the country, not just in Illinois, they expanded graduate and professional training. They added doctoral programs. They added a significant research component. And in years where budgets were stable and student enrollments were good, you could sustain that model. And in this era, it simply isn't sustainable. And so what universities are struggling with now, and particularly in Illinois, is what does an institution that at one time had 20,000 students look like when they have 12? And that is part of what I think boards need to be thinking about. You know, what can we do to recruit more students? Everyone wants to do that. But what kind of institution should we be in the future? And can we afford to look like many versions of Urbana-Champaign? And we simply can't. There aren't enough dollars to do it. This institution, Illinois State, is a good example of a place that years ago decided to focus on undergraduate education and limit the proliferation of expensive low enrollment graduate programs. And unfortunately, at lots of places, that hasn't been done. And going forward, boards are going to have to insist that, that leadership teams look very closely at where money is being spent on campus and begin to roll back some of those things that we've been doing that are good but not essential to our core mission.
Those are tough challenges for a board. But you're saying we need to have those conversations.
Your university has statistics that will show you exactly how many freshmen, sophomore, junior, and senior are in particular departments and what numbers are in those departments and what classes they're taking. And I think Lester looked at it and realized we could not sustain women's studies, African studies, and philosophy as majors. So we made those, you can still get a minor in those, but you cannot get a major because they're not supporting themselves. And that's the problem we're having.
And part of the problem with our industry is that public universities have always tried to be all things to all people. And not very many of them are very good at saying, this is what we're good at, this is what the public needs and wants, and we're going to focus on those areas. When I was president here, the Politics and Government Department lobbied the administration to add a doctoral program. And we said no. The demand isn't there, we can't afford it, and it's not something we want to do.
It's not easy to say no.
I think philosophically that everyone is, I think, on the same page. I mean, Northern just went through this, a very rigorous program prioritization process. But then all these great ideas come up, but we can't make all of the changes because of civil service, right? But really, it's a lot of it has to do with the civil service issues. But then I think on another front is, yes, ideally we want to say we'd like to cut programs, but then this has to be in sync with other universities because we also don't want to eliminate programs in a particular region, right? Because if your university is the only university that will provide a certain type of programming for students in an entire region, and you're going to cut that, then where are those students going to go? So I think that there also needs to be, a state level perspective and view on programming across the state.
It's fair.
And how do the universities work together to make sure that we're serving the students, also making sure we're serving the students with the right programs to do, where there are careers and jobs in the state, right? But,
And I can't point to a single state that does a real good job of the sort of statewide coordination that you're talking about. In California, which probably has one of the best public higher ed systems in the country, even it doesn't do that very well. And part of it is that the Illinois Board of Higher Education is not the governing board for each institution, and so the level of authority here to sort of mandate some of that is not in our portfolio.
I also think the IBHE can help you on the collective messaging, assuming there's, Al brought up a good point of maybe rethinking how you want to, what your university looks like, but collectively pushing higher ed as a message. But I also think, and I don't mean to offend anybody, I have a real struggle in doing this for a year and a half of knowing what all our universities, who they are, and what their brand is, and what their, why would somebody go there? And I think that's, for me, that's something I think we can help on. If I know when people think of Northern, what do they think about? Or ISU, what do they think about? And making sure that you have a brand and you have a name, and you have, when people think about you, they go, wow, they're good at this, 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 and this. And I think that we can do better on that, and not picking on anyone in particular, but I think that's a challenge for each school, and I think it's a challenge for the IBHE to be a partner with you on that.
I think with the conglomerate of doing the higher education thing, this whole has to be the Board of Higher Ed. I don't want to be thrown
Yeah.
I know I am.
I wasn't suggesting that. I'm talking about marketing and messaging. Yeah.
Marketing's gonna have to go through you as a whole, but we're gonna have to do our own individual. It's nice to talk, it's nice to work together, but if we don't set ourselves out, we're not gonna be able to have anybody come to a specific university.
Yeah, because look, I agree, but everybody's got a good story to tell. And it's a matter of, it's a campaign and a marketing of why is Western so good? And why is Eastern better than Indiana State? And making sure that that message, you know, boom, it's almost a political campaign. You got to say it over and over and over. Oh, wow, Eastern does that really well. Or now, you know, Governor State, da-da-da. So I'm just saying we can help on that, but each individual school needs to do it. I agree. Yes?
Okay, but my original topic of my statement/question was what you're mentioning, marketing collectively, not in regards to our individual brand, but just how is it possible for a governing body, IBHE, whatever that body may be, to put out Illinois-wide
Yeah.
specifically, it's a wonderful place to go to university. I'm not saying which university, but we don't have any of that happening. We have no loss mitigation of getting the information out that we're now moving forward. We're beyond we're in the process of being beyond the concerns that have been evident. But where is it going out to the public, indicating that our universities is where you should be? You're in Illinois, you're an Illinois resident, go to school in Illinois. That's all I was saying, in general.
I 100% agree that that can be a role, IBHE.
Right, in general, not specific.
I get that.
University branding, because at that time, that's our responsibility.
I was trying to say two things. 100% agree with you that that's something we can do. As an aside, I think there's still challenges for each university to market and brand themselves that I don't think they're there yet. I said, all I meant was if we can help on data, if we can help on metrics, if we can help when you're doing that, if you're the executive director and out talking about, he or she can say, what about this, what about this and this, or the chairman saying, what about this and this. I just think they're two different things we've got to work on, but we are the entity that can be proactively pushing higher ed and should be proactively pushing higher ed. We agree. I'm not going to repeat myself. All right.
Would it be a worthwhile goal for the IBHE or the General Assembly or someone to have a target for our net migration or improvement there, right? For that to be a stated objective when we start.
Al, you might have some, I don't want to.
I guess I have two thoughts on that. It's absolutely a noble goal. You know, I think the outmigration is a product of two factors. Three. The higher ed in the Midwest has become very competitive because of the shrinking pool of 18-year-olds. And so the states around us have been poaching our students, offering in-state tuition to out-of-state students and so forth. So we're dealing with that. We're also dealing with a situation where some of the regional publics don't appeal to high ACT students who don't get into a flagship. And so if a kid that has a 29 ACT and doesn't get into the engineering program at the U of I, will that kid go to Northern? Probably not. They'll look at Iowa, they'll look at Mizzou, and so collectively as a state, part of our challenge is that the regional publics here need to look better and need to be more appealing to those high achieving students that get recruited away. And then thirdly, we took a huge hit by having a budget impasse for nearly 2 years. And high school students who don't pay attention to the news knew all about that. And many of them that I've talked to anecdotally have told me that they didn't apply to a single Illinois public university because they were afraid that they would enroll in the program that they wanted wouldn't be there. And you know, it's just going to take a while before that washes away.
Yeah, you can imagine we start some type of campaign and then there's no budget in May. I mean, we think about this. We're not ignoring it, but So good point. Did I cut you off? I didn't have to. Elaine?
Yeah, I agree with Al totally about the damage, the deep damage that was done with this two-year budget impasse. Buzz talked about a 17% cut over 3 years in Syracuse when he first came in. The first year of the budget impasse, most of us had a 70% cut, 7-0. So everything we're talking about here has to be seen in that larger context. And let me say I disagree with Al very emphatically on the fact that our regional universities and other universities are trying to be weak imitations of our flagship. I mean, I think things have really changed maybe in the years since you've been away, Al. I mean, I really see much more of a brand differentiation. I know for us, we made a very conscious decision to put most focus on a model undergraduate program that emulates most of what was said in the presentation from the Partnership for Community Completion. And I think for each of the universities, we can see that there is differentiation. Now, everybody needs an English department. I'm an English professor, but that isn't why I'm saying it. It's that and in our institution, we're putting a tremendous impact, even during the budget impasse, on foundation level courses, including English composition, and only full-time faculty teach our foundation courses. Now that's very unusual, and it's not something that can or will go on in a flagship. My other point is to all of you as board members. I came to Illinois from a state that had a very complex bureaucracy, where the money was being, I felt, too far away from the students, to a state where we had individual governing boards. And I have to say, what we have been able, and I think my colleagues would echo this, because we've had individual governing boards, we've been able to be nimble, we've been able to be innovative, we've been able to get through these last 2 years. And the resilience of our getting through that is quite remarkable, and I'm not sure how many other states could have overseen that. So I want to say a big thank you to all of you who are serving as volunteers on these boards. And the Tribune, Chicago Tribune, which I read every day, is making a big push of they all want to be the flagship, they're not differentiated, let's have some super board. And I would just say to all of you, please, please help us resist that. And finally, I know that we have to be realistic, and Tom's been really clear that we don't know what's going to happen in May. But let me just say this. This is something we can all join together on. It can't happen again that we have another budget impasse. The damage will be irreparable. And somehow, together, all of the boards, all of the public universities, IBHE, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because we can't, the reputational loss that we've all been talking about in various ways was because of that 2 years of high school guidance counselors in Illinois telling families not to go to any Illinois public. And we have to, I don't know what it is, and with IBHE's leadership, Al's leadership, Tom's leadership, we have to figure out a way that there is a budget on May 31st of 2018. Because if there isn't, everything else we're talking about in this room will be for naught.
That's good. Anyone else?
I think you got into students involved too.
Yes.
Again, back on the cost issue a little bit. By the way, thank you. Spot on. We somehow ran some of these numbers in Northern that Virginia gets for their state university gets 60% of their funding from the state, and Michigan gets 5%. Those are pretty good state university programs, I think. So is there something IBHE can look to see, what are they doing?
I'm sure.
We could buy on that?
I'm sure we can figure that out if we don't have it.
That would be really helpful,
All right.
I think, for us. And then the other thing might be, just maybe, I'm not talking about combining and stuff like that, but back office wise. I mean, just IT, the money we spend on IT, it just, there's something IBHE can look
Aren't we also, what's the organization, Jamie or Al, that we belong in, the Midwest PAC, or are we able to buy things through that what's the organization? Help me out. What is it? And how do we use that PAC?
There are shared purchasing programs as part of that.
Must not be, but not enough. Technology's not in there? What about things like electricity? I mean, can you all pool that? Can you do electricity?
Obviously, we can't.
Well, I was, just as an example, I was trying to figure out where you could pool water. Al, or Larry?
Just a couple of observations.
Yeah.
You're exactly right about Virginia. You're right about Michigan. You can throw Colorado in there.
All right.
The difference between those and Illinois is that they didn't have the drop off the ledge that we have. They haven't had budget impasses. So if there's a step down, I think everybody anticipates that as Buzz said this morning, we're not going to go back. I'm not sure we ever had Brady days, but the step down is probably going to continue to occur. I think everybody agrees with that. Because you don't go from 18%, and then the next year have no budget, and then the best you can hope for, you got a 70% cut. And those things are just unpredictable. So that's the difference. If there was strategies, and we're using some in Illinois State, to do a reasonable step down over time, hopeful that that will work out that way. But ultimately, as I say publicly a lot, there's only really two things that we control at the university related to all this. Number one is our planning processes. And those are different for every institution in here. Ours are pretty good and they're scalable. But no plan anticipated a 70% cut in 2 years of no consistency in the budget. So planning is important and attitude is important. So we control our attitude as well. And based upon the conversation today, last year when we had this session, it was a good session. But I came away from last year's session thinking that it was really about the board serving in a fiduciary role, which my interpretation, based upon those conversations, is mainly about financial issues. Today with this discussion, my takeaway is that fiduciary is really about taking care of the institution in general. That includes reputation, that includes working together to try to promote higher education in the state of Illinois to keep students here, hopefully attracting some other folks back in. So to me, this is a more productive conversation by really talking about advocacy. How can presidents and boards work together, work with IBHE, delighted to be able to work with Al, Tom, and all the rest of the IBHE staff. So we can hopefully get to a point where planning that we've done is taken into account, and we can all do this with a positive, let's move forward kind of attitude. We can't do anything about the past, that's history. The only thing we can do is learn from the present.
I speak 100% agree with that. I'll say this as a former legislator. It's one thing, and this will sound bad, it's one thing to have a university person come in to see you as a legislator, and that carries weight, and that's important. And if I'm in Bloomington and Dan Brady, you come in to see Dan Brady, that's important. But if Bob Dobsky's coming in, he's the owner of the McDonald's, and then he's very active in the community, his tentacles are all over the place, and then someone else comes in, and someone else comes in, and someone else comes in from the board, then the tentacles just get broader and broader and broader. You are all leaders in your respective communities, and you have a lot more influence than you think with legislators. So it's, again, great that the president needs to come in. That's what he or she does, and they're very articulate, and they have the talking points down. But when you're coming in, that has a lot more impact than you realize to individual legislators. So be the advocate is what Larry's saying. That is critical, and to Elaine's point, if we can't just do the same playbook. It didn't work, all right? Where we all just come in and students are part of it and we're all part of it, but you've got to look at this in different ways to convince the legislature of the irreparable harm, and you are the ones that can help change that conversation, in my opinion, to individual legislators, because they're expecting Larry Dietz to come in, and Larry Dietz is very good, and Dave is, and Elaine is, and go, but you need to be coming in, and you need to be talking to legislators, and you need to be talking about it at home, and in the DeKalbs, and the Charlestons, or wherever, and in the suburbs, where these kids are having the conversations with their parents. And you have to be able to rebut what's going on with guidance counselors and teachers. Because what happens is, this conversation of how bad it is, we perpetuate it when we talk about how bad it is. And we have to change the conversation and remind people how good our schools are. It ain't going to change that much in Springfield overnight, but you can help change the conversation. So this has been, to me, one of the best meetings I've been to since I've been the chair of Board of Higher Ed. It's because of you guys. So thank you all very, very much, and have safe travel home. Unless, yeah, we're done.